Turn with me to Matthew chapter 2, if you would, please. And let's talk about honoring Jesus' birth today. Honoring Jesus' birth. How do we celebrate or honor the birth of a child? What's included in a child being born in our day and in our culture? Well, first of all, there's the pregnancy announcement. I personally love the one that my daughter put on Facebook a couple of years ago. It had an open oven door with one little bun sitting in the oven. You figure it out. Often they share with us an ultrasound photo. And then there's a baby shower. And then there's a birth announcement and a Facebook page. A birth certificate, a social security number. Often there's pictures at the hospital or pictures at home or visits from siblings and grandparents and relatives and friends. When family and friends hear the news, there's a variety of responses. And during this COVID-19 time, most just smile and content themselves with pictures and maybe a phone call or a Skype or a video call. But there was a very different kind of reaction by one group who received the baby announcement about Jesus' birth. Matthew chapter 2, beginning with verse 1. Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the reign of King Herod. About that time, some wise men from eastern lands arrived in Jerusalem asking, "Where is the newborn King of the Jews? We saw his star as it rose, and we've come to worship him." King Herod was deeply disturbed when he heard this, as was everybody in Jerusalem. You've heard that old saying, haven't you? When King Herod's not happy, ain't nobody happy. It's interesting that our expectations don't always match up with reality. The Magi went to Jerusalem expecting that everyone in the capital city would know where the newborn King of the Jews was at. But on the streets, nobody knew. So being from the royal class of people in their own country, they naturally went to the current king in Jerusalem, King Herod, and asked where they could find the newborn King of the Jews. They were prepared to honor his birth. Well, King Herod didn't know, and he was deeply disturbed at the thought, and maybe a Messiah had been born and would eventually try and take over his kingdom. But even though Herod didn't know, he knew how to find out. So verse 4, he called a meeting of the leading priests and teachers of the law and asked, "Where is the Messiah supposed to be born?" And those leading priests and teachers of the law quoted the scripture we read while Al lit the candles this morning. In Bethlehem in Judea, they said, "For this is what the prophet wrote. And you, Bethlehem in the land of Judah, are not least among the ruling cities of Judah, for a ruler will come from you who will be the shepherd of my people Israel." I like to put my imagination into the scriptures, and I'm guessing that King Herod had some lingering doubts as to whether there really was a baby born in a sheep-herding village of Bethlehem who would be the Messiah. So instead of investigating himself, he commissioned the Magi. Let them do the dusty traveling and then report their findings back to him on the way home. Verse 7, then Herod called for a private meeting with the wise men, and he learned from them the time when the star first appeared. And then he told them, "Go to Bethlehem and search carefully for the child, and when you find him, come back and tell me so that I can go and worship him too." Did Herod really want to honor Jesus' birth by worshiping him? Not likely. You know, if it had been up to King Herod, there would not even have been the honor of an obituary in the Jerusalem Times newspaper. So the Magi were off searching for baby Jesus for the purpose of honoring his birth. Right from the start, what they were finding was very different from what they had been expecting. Fact is, God had to offer special directions for them in order to find Jesus at all. Now, for those of us living in our day, remember back to the olden days before Google Maps on your phone? People who were traveling had to use paper maps, or they had to stop and ask for directions. For the most part, us men were not the quickest to stop and ask for directions. And since the Magi were men, it took special directions from God in order for them to find baby Jesus. Verse 9, after this interview, the wise men went on their way, and the star they had seen in the east guided them to Bethlehem. It went ahead of them and stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were filled with joy. They were expecting a popular child in the capital city, living as royalty, with the entire nation cheering the little guy on. But the star guided them to a very small sheep herder's village, to an insignificant small house. What impresses me about these Magi is that they didn't let their unmet expectations keep them from finding God. Even though the situation wasn't at all what they were expecting, still they persistently looked for God, even in the unlikely places they were directed to. Verse 11, I love this picture on the screen. They entered the house and saw the child with his mother, Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. They opened their treasure chests and gave him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Wasn't a baby anymore, probably around close to 2 years old, living in a house there in Bethlehem. An artist put this picture together. It's the first picture I've seen personally of Jesus as a toddler living in a house with the wise men. And look at the faces of those Magi. The Magi are great role models for us in several different ways. First of all, they kept looking for God. Verse 11, they entered the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary. Folks, wise men and women of every age, when they're handed a difficult situation, they don't panic about the problem. They hold steady and they say, God is somewhere in this insignificance of life. There's something here I can learn. I'm going to keep at it because God is somewhere in this. Do you need to hear that word after almost a year of COVID-19? Interesting. Oh, our lives have been so different from what we expected this year. Can you find God in this kind of life? Well, the Old Testament son of Jacob, Joseph, was a wise man who did this. He understood how to find God in the difficult situations of life. His older brothers treated him badly. So badly, they went so far as to sell him into slavery and then tell their father that he had been killed by a wild animal. You know, that's the worst thing I have ever heard happen to a pesky little brother. The slave traders took him to Egypt, where he was bought by Potiphar and put to work as a slave. But he did his best, and he was lied about and sentenced to prison by his owner. Even while in prison, he still did his best and worked his way up the prison food chain to the point that he was doing the prison warden's work. You know the story of how eventually God stepped in and had Joseph appointed to be the prime minister of the whole country. And when a famine forced Joseph's family to go to Egypt in search of food, what did Joseph tell them? You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good, for the saving of many people. When Joseph found himself in difficult situation after difficult situation, he looked for God and he found him. Look at Job sitting in a pile of ashes, scraping his sores with a broken piece of pottery. Job was a good man who never did anything wrong, but there he is, grieving the loss of his family, all of his wealth, and his body in horrible pain. His friends were telling him to curse God and die, but he said, "The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." In the most difficult time in life, Job looked for God and he found him. David wrote Psalm 23 in a cave while he was running from his own son who wanted to take over his kingdom. In the middle of the most difficult time in his life, David looked to God and said, "The Lord is my shepherd, and I have everything that I need." The Apostle Paul was in prison for preaching Jesus. And while in prison, he's writing to the church at Philippi, telling them to rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. During a very difficult time, Paul looked for God and he found him. You know, some good Christian people only see God in the good times. When everything seems to be going well, they say, well, it must be from God since everything that's happening is good. And that might be true. It is nice when everything's going well. I really like it when everything's going well. But folks, when things are not going well, God is still there. But oftentimes we have to look for him. You may be going through a difficult time in your life right now. Like the wise men, you may have been following a star that you thought was going to lead you to a palace. And instead, you ended up in insignificance. Remember, when wise men were following a star and ended up in an insignificant sheep herder's village, they looked for God and they found him. Here's another way the wise men can be role models for us. When the Magi found an insignificant little house at the end of a star, they still offered God their very best. Look at verse 11. They entered the house, saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. Then they opened their treasure chests and gave him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Folks, when situations are not going well in our life, it's tempting to hold back on doing our best and giving our best. It's tempting to do just whatever's easiest and just make do. I hate that phrase, whatever's easiest. A marriage counselor reports this happens often in marriages that he deals with. He says the marriage isn't what it should be, and all of a sudden the marriage partners say, well, maybe I want to hold back. And they begin to hold back their feelings and they begin to withdraw. The times when we need to give our very best are when our expectations are not being met. When we followed a star and ended up at an extremely insignificant place. But when the Magi came to an out-of-the-way small town, the little house, they didn't look at each other and say, look at what we've got here. It really wouldn't matter if we didn't give all of those gifts that we had planned, and nobody's going to know the difference. The great author on leadership, John Maxwell, says the difference between the average and the above average person lies in just 3 little words: and then some. He says great people of God and great people in society give their best and then some. They forgive people and then some. They are always walking the extra mile. They're always taking the extra step, even though it takes extra effort. Shortly after World War II, Winston Churchill said, "The world is being run by tired men." And when asked to explain, he meant that those who really make a mark for God in history are those who take the extra step, walk the second mile, give their best to a difficult situation, even when it doesn't look promising and all that extra work makes them tired. Back before COVID-19 shut down all the tourist sites in Washington, D.C., a tourist and his family were visiting the Washington Monument, that real tall display there. There's an elevator that can take you all the way to the top floor where you can look out over the Washington Capitol. There was a 2-hour wait to get on that elevator to go to the top. This particular tourist was impatient. He walked up to the attendant at the elevator and said, "Is there any way we can get to the top faster than waiting for 2 hours in this line?" The elevator attendant responded, "You can go up right now if you're willing to take the stairs." He went back to the elevator line. Most people are willing to stand around and wait for an elevator. In America today, this mindset has resulted in a workforce that is willing to put in time for a paycheck. They'd rather do that than to do their best at creating something of the highest quality. But when the Magi found an insignificant little house in a sheep herder's village at the end of the star, they still honored Jesus' birth with their very best. They worshiped him. They offered gifts: gold fit for a king, frankincense, incense, a gift for a priest, myrrh and embalming spice, a gift for one who was going to die. They gave their best and then some. A third way that the wise men can be a role model for us today is when they ended up at a place that seemed insignificant at the end of the star, they changed their direction in life. Look at verse 12. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. Have you ever gone through a very difficult time, and when it was completed and life finally got back on track, you discovered that you had changed? Well, this visit by the wise men to Jesus changed the whole direction of their lives. They were more in touch with God, and they did not go back to Herod. Sometimes the most significant thing about a difficult life is the change that happens to us in the process. As I look back on the most difficult struggles that Carla and I have experienced throughout our lifetimes, I see that who and what we are today is really the result of going through those very difficult situations with God at our side, directing us every step of the way. The Magi had headed out on a significant trip. Their purpose was to honor Jesus' birth. Did they find the one who had been born King of the Jews? Definitely. Just not in the palace in Jerusalem, but in a small house in an out-of-the-way, little insignificant sheepherders village called Bethlehem. And when they found the baby and his mother, they recognized him as the one they were looking for. They found God in this out-of-the-way little place. They proceeded to offer him their very best. They bowed down and worshiped him. They opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. And they changed their whole direction in life. You know, we don't ever hear from these magi in history again. We don't know what happened to them. But I'm confident that they arrived back home, different men from what they were before they followed that star, and they found things very different from what they expected. For us, in this COVID-19 year of 2020, here's how we can honor Jesus' birth. Let's look for God. Look back through this past year and look for God. We might not see him right away. We may have to really get our telescope out and look closely. But he's visible to those of us who will persistently look for him. Then let's do our very best. Just because life isn't turning out the way we had expected doesn't mean that we can get sloppy and do whatever's easiest. Let's do our best and then some. Also in this year, let's allow God to change the direction of our lives if he so chooses. Let's allow God to use the difficulties of life during this time to mold us and shape us into better people. You know, God has such bigger plans for us than we could ever hope or expect. God has plans to change us to become more and more like Jesus in our attitudes and our actions and in our reactions. Folks, that's a challenge for us that we can take into a new year. Our musicians are coming, and let's worship him as we close by singing "Joy to the World, the Lord has come." May the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace. Amen. If you'd like an extra minute to get out before the crowd heads for the door, this is your cue. Hustle toward the door. And then the rest of you, when you're comfortable, you are dismissed.